A new Sky News documentary called The Real Cost of Net Zero will tonight lift the lid on Australia's pursuit of a greener future. Our political contributor, Chris Uhlmann, will examine what Labor's commitment to achieving 82% renewables by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050 really means for Australia. For a preview of the doco, I'm joined by the man himself, Chris Uhlmann. Chris, thanks so much for your time. I think this is one of the most important documentaries we've ever made here at Sky News, but what do you want people to get out of it when they watch it tonight?
I want people to understand what's really happening with the electricity grid and why the promise of a greener and cheaper future, and let's not forget that's what it was, that it would be greener and that it would be cheaper, was never going to happen, even at the time that it was promised. Because the cost of electricity is not set by the lowest cost of generation, it's set by the highest cost of generation. Wind and solar, when they're put into a grid at scale, leave massive supply gaps. Those supply gaps get filled by something. At the moment, the dominant source of generation is, of course, brown and black coal, a relatively cheap source of power over a long period of time. As they exit the marketplace, what's going to happen? Well, the price will more often be set by pumped hydro, as it is at the moment. In fact, most of the last quarter was set at major generators pumped hydro, or gas, another expensive option, or, guess what, batteries, the most expensive option of all if you discount using diesel generators, which we do in places like South Australia to keep the lights on. So what we're doing is actually preposterous, ridiculously expensive, and you could argue that it's not green because of the amount of land that's going to have to be given over to these occasional gatherers, these energy gatherers.
Not only that, the waste that wind and solar also produce, the minerals that still need to be dug out of the ground to produce and manufacture what is required to go into solar and wind as well. So, Chris, you've been asking these important questions for about 20 years in Canberra, perhaps even longer. How did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where that lie in politics that green is cheaper has just been able to filter through?
Well, I'm afraid I've come to the conclusion that the political class that is running us, and don't forget that both major parties in the end have signed up to net zero by 2050, are absolutely, completely energy illiterate. Your lifestyle is a product of the amount of energy you get to use. So the amount of energy that we burn to make heat to do work. That is where our lifestyle came from. I came past a sign today as I came into Parliament House which says coal kills kids. Well, I invite you to rewind to about 1900 when we had no electricity and look at the life expectancy of everybody then and look at the number of children who died in childbirth. You know, hydrocarbons are the thing that gave us the lifestyle that we have now, and we use them in all manner of ways. 80% of the world's primary energy still runs on hydrocarbons. We can want to wish this away if that's the case, but all that it means is that we will turn a rich society into a poor society, and other countries like China, which now burns 56% of the world's coal, and more coal was burned last year than has been burned in all of human history in a single year. It will get burned somewhere, just not here.
Yeah, that's right. We are resources rich. It should be the cheapest form of energy that we should be taking advantage of. Now, we're not saying at all, and your documentary is not saying don't pursue wind and solar at any level. Yes, it should be pursued, but it's all about diversification, isn't it? And one of the things that gets me is that, you know, gas for a long time was trumpeted as this important transition fuel. It's cleaner than coal, but somewhere along the way it was completely demonised. How did that happen?
Well, you can blame the Energy Minister for part of that because he went to not this COP, the latest Council of the Parties, which is the jamboree that we have where, you know, 70,000 odd people turn up on private jets to sort of talk to the world about climate change. Well, at the last one before this, he said that fossil fuel had no place in our energy system. So he combined coal and gas together to demonise the fuel. The Victorian government put a ban on the exploration for gas that's underneath its feet. And New South Wales did very little to assist the process. So essentially, we've created a domestic gas crisis. Now, I have seen a place in the world where the price of electricity is really quite cheap, comparatively speaking. That's in Texas. And why? It's got more wind and solar on its grid than California, but it has cheap and abundant gas. Because the other thing that happened while we were being lectured by the Biden administration in the United States about our coal exports is that the United States, because of fracking, grew to be the largest producer of oil in the world. Larger than Saudi Arabia, 20% of the world's oil, 25% of its natural gas. The United States is rich and powerful because it didn't do what it was saying it was going to do. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, China's not doing this, if the United States is not doing this, if India is not doing this, then what are we doing, and what is the cost of what we're doing?
Well, it's a really good question. We're going to find out in your documentary tonight. Also, in the last 2 weeks, Donald Trump has been elected for another 4 years in the United States, you may have noticed. Do you think that changes things dramatically for us?
It's great for consumers. It'll be great for energy consumers because if he goes with drill, baby, drill, which, by the way, is an extension of what they've already been doing, and Chris Wright, as much as people might scream about him, is the most energy literate energy secretary they'll ever have. So he's in charge of Liberty Energy. He was one of the drivers of fracking in the United States. For those that worry about climate change, by the way, the reduction, and the United States had the biggest reduction in the last 15 years of fossil fuels, of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, came from the United States, which replaced coal with natural gas. It burns cleaner. It burns so cleanly, by the way, that we can burn it in our households. That's how clean natural gas is. And that guy was behind that reduction in fossil fuels. Now, expect that there will be an outcry about him being there, but Donald Trump is about to pull out of the Paris Agreement, and I expect Argentina will follow him. And then the rest of the world will look around at the deck of cards that it's got in its hand and wonder what on earth it's doing, and look at the example of a place like Germany. What did Germany manage to do? It built the system that we wanted, Laura. It had the wind that we were after. And guess what? It didn't work without Russian gas. They had outsourced their energy security to a country that was likely to become an adversary. And by the way, I think energy explains most of geopolitics. So I think that Russia was emboldened to invade Ukraine because it did not believe that Germany would be able to fight back because the lifeline to its energy came directly from its adversary. And who puts themselves in that kind of position? And by the way, we're now going to be importing liquefied natural gas into Australia, and we've got tons of it. We're just not using it. And geostrategically, how stupid is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you don't mince your words, Chris, and absolutely. It's a good question. How stupid is that? I think the answer is very. But nothing focuses the mind like an election. We've got one just around the corner. Do you think there's an opportunity from being out of this documentary to perhaps recalibrate what Australia's long-term and medium-term goals are on energy?
Yeah, look, I think we need to have a conversation about what we're doing and ask ourselves the question as we look around the world. If carbon emissions in the world have risen every single year since we began the carbon cutting journey at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which they did, the only time, by the way, they ever get cut is when there is some kind of massive recession. So during the financial crisis, and we cut them dramatically during COVID. And that's a picture of the future. If you want to see what the energy future looks like, don't use any, and you can actually achieve this. I think that if the argument had been put to the Australian people at the outset is that, look, we think that climate change is really important. It is happening. We need to do something about it. But this is the trade-off. The trade-off is that the grid that we're going to be building will be extremely expensive, deeply unreliable, and you are going to have to sacrifice part of your cost of living. Do you think that they would have signed up for that project?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying now is we should have an honest discussion. And by the way, there is no cheap energy future from here, Laura. It is, yes, nuclear energy is very expensive, but by the way, it provides baseload power. And now the artificial intelligence centres of the world, that's what they want.
Yeah, there's no cheap option. Remember the neg under Malcolm Turnbull. Remember the greatest moral challenge of our time under Kevin Rudd. And here we are all these years later, really still debating it. But what strikes me about this, Chris, is that during those times, it was relatively good times. You had, lower interest rates. People were feeling like they were getting ahead. Now we're smack bang in the middle of a housing and cost of living crisis where, it always happens. We could see this happening. Climate change then, is all of a sudden down the list of priorities because people are struggling to put food on the table and pay their bills.
And two things on earth explain the way that people operate in the long run. One is energy and the other is food. And so when those things come under threat, then that's when governments change. So look, the government continue on the path that it's going at the moment. It can continue, and by the way, they've never backed away from that $275 pledge. But I genuinely think in interviews now, the energy minister should be laughed out of the room with some of the things that he says. Somebody who says that the wind and sun don't send a bill, that's not a serious human being. Right? The wind and sun might not send a bill, but your energy retailer does. And by the way, turning it into a competent electricity system is ridiculously expensive. So we've got options and we should look at them. The Earth does not come to an end in 2050. No matter what people say, climate change is not an existential crisis. Do we adapt or do we spend money, do we spend an enormous amount of money trying to believe that from Australia we can change the climate when China's not doing it, India's not doing it, Indonesia's not doing it, and quite obviously the United States is not now going to be doing it. So what on earth are we doing?
Well, if only the Energy Minister would do interviews, Chris, then I could ask all of those questions. Thank you so much for joining AM Agenda this morning. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Take care.
Chris Uhlmann's exclusive new documentary, The Real Cost of Net Zero, airs tonight at 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, and that is one not to miss.